Mistresses of Famous Men, taken from Book 13 of the Deipnosophists by Athenaeus of Naucratis, translated by C. D. Young. I will speak of that most devoted lover of truth, Epicurus, who, never having been initiated into the encyclic series of learning, used to say that those were well off who applied themselves to philosophy in the same way in which he did himself, and these were his words. I praise and congratulate you, my young man, because you have come over to the study of philosophy, unimbued with any system. On which account Timon styles him the most unlettered schoolmaster alive. Now, had not this very Epicurus Leontiయొn for his mistress, her, I mean, who was so celebrated as a courtesan? But she did not cease to live as a prostitute when she began to learn philosophy, but still prostituted herself to the whole sect of the Epicureans in the gardens, and to Epicurus himself in the most open manner, so that this great philosopher was exceedingly fond of her, though he mentions this fact in his letters to Hermarchus. But as for Lais of Hycara, and Hycara is a city in Sicily, from which place she came to Corinth, having been made a prisoner of war, as Polemon relates in the 6th book of his Reply to Timaeus, and Aristippus was one of her lovers, and so was Demosthenes the orator and Diogenes the cynic. And it was also said that the Aphrodite, which is at Corinth and is called Myrrhina, appeared to her in a dream, intimating to her by such an appearance that she would be courted by many lovers of great wealth. Lais, I say, is mentioned by Hypereides in the second of his speeches against Aristotle, and Apelles the painter, having seen Lais while she was still a maiden, drawing water at the fountain Phryne, and marvelling at her beauty, took her with him on one occasion to a banquet of his friends, and when his companions laughed at him because he had brought a maiden with him to the party instead of a courtesan, he said, Do not wonder, for I will show you that she is quite beautiful enough for future enjoyment within 3 years. And a prediction of the sort was made by Socrates also, respecting Theodote the Athenian, as Xenophon tells us in his Memorabilia. For he used to say that she was very beautiful, and had a bosom finely shaped beyond all description. And let us go and see the woman, for people cannot judge of beauty by hearsay. But Lais was so beautiful that painters used to come over to her and copy her bosom and breasts. And Lais was a rival of Phryne, and had an immense number of lovers, never caring whether they're rich or poor, and never treating them with any insolence. And Aristippus every year used to spend whole days with her in Aegina at the festival of Poseidon, and once, being reproached by his servant, who said to him, You give her such large sums of money, but she admits Diogenes the cynic for nothing. He answered, I give Lais a great deal, that I myself may enjoy her, and not that no one else may. And when Diogenes said, Since you, O Aristippus, cohabit with a common prostitute, either therefore become a cynic yourself as I am, or else abandon her. Aristippus answered him, Does it appear to you, O Diogenes, an absurd thing to live in a house where other men have lived before you? Not at all, said he. Well, then, does it appear to you absurd to sail in a ship in which other men have sailed before you? By no means, said he. Well, then, it is not a bit more absurd to be in love with a woman with whom many men have been in love already. And Nymphodorus the Syracusan, in his treatise on people who have been admired and eminent in Sicily, says that Lais was a native of Hycara, which he describes as a strong fortress in Sicily. But Stratus, in his play entitled The Macedonians, or Pausanias, says that she was a Corinthian, in the following lines. A. Where do these girls come from, and who are they? B. At present they are come from Megara, but they by birth are all Corinthians. This one is Lais, who is so well known. And Timaeus in the 13th book of his history says she came from Hycara, using the word in the plural number, as Polemon has stated, where he says that she was murdered by some women in Thessaly, because she was beloved by a Thessalian of the name of Pausanias, and that she was beaten to death out of envy and jealousy by wooden footstools in the temple of Aphrodite, and that from this circumstance that temple is called the Temple of the Impious Aphrodite, and that her tomb is shown on the banks of the Peneus, having on it an emblem of a stone water ewer, and this inscription: "This is the tomb of Lais, to whose beauty, equal to that of the heavenly goddesses, the glorious and unconquered Greece did bow. Love was her father, Corinth was her home. Now in the rich Thessalian plain she lies, so that those men talk nonsense who say that she was buried in Corinth, near the cranium." And did not Aristotle of Stagira have a son named Nicomachus by a courtesan named Herpyllis? And did he not live with her till his death, as Hermippus informs us in the first book of his Life of Aristotle, saying that great care was taken of her in the philosopher's will? And did not our admirable Plato love Archaeanassa, a courtesan of Colophon, so that even he composed a song in her honor? "My mistress is the fair Archaeanassa, from Colophon, a damsel in whom love sits on her very wrinkles irresistible. Wretched are those whom the flower of youth, when first she came across the sea, she met. They must have been entirely consumed." And did not Pericles the Olympian, as Clearchus tells us in the first book of his treatise on amatory matters, throw all Greece into confusion on account of Aspasia? Not the younger one, but that one who associated with the wise Socrates, and that too, though he was a man who had acquired such a vast reputation for wisdom and political sagacity. But indeed Pericles was always a man much addicted to amorous indulgences, and he cohabitated even with his own son's wife, as Stesimbrotus the Thasian informs us. And Stesimbrotus was a contemporary of his, and had seen him, as he tells us in his book entitled A Treatise on Themistocles, and Thucydides, and Pericles. And Antisthenes, the pupil of Socrates, tells us that Pericles, being in love with Aspasia, used to kiss her twice every day, once when he entered her house, and once when he left it. And when she was impeached for impiety, he himself spoke in her behalf, and shed more tears for her sake than he did when his own property and his own life were imperiled. Moreover, when Cimon had had an incestuous affair with Elpinice, his sister, who was afterwards given in marriage to Callias, and, when he was banished, Pericles contrived his recall, exacting the favors of Elpinice as his recompense. And Pythanateus, in the third book of his History of Aegina, says that Periander fell violently in love with Melissa, the daughter of Procles of Epidaurus, when he had seen her clothed in the Peloponnesian fashion, for she had on no cloak but a single tunic only, and was acting as a cupbearer to the young men. And he married her. And Tigris of Leucadia was the mistress of Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, who was the third in descent from that Pyrrhus who invaded Italy. But Olympias, the young man's mother, took her off by poison. And Ulpianus, as if he had gotten some unexpected gain, while Myrtillus was still speaking, said, "Do we say O Tigris in the masculine gender? For I know that Philemon says this in his play called Neaera. A. Just as Seleucus sent the tiger ton tigrin here, which we have seen, so we in turn ought now to send Seleucus back a beast from here. Let's send him a trigaranus, for that's an animal not known much in those parts." And Myrtillus said to him, "Since you interpreted us when we were making out a catalogue of women, not like the list of Socrates of Phanagoria, or like the catalogue of women of Niconetus, of Samos, or Abdera, whichever was really his native country, I, digressing a little, will turn to your question, my old phoenix. Learn, then, that Alexis, in his Firelighter, has said, ton tigrin, using the word in the masculine gender, and these are his words. Come, open quick the door. I've been here, though all unseen, walking some time. A statue, a millstone, and a hippopotamus and a wall. The tiger, O Tigrin of Seleucus. And I might quote other examples of the fact, but I postpone them for the present while I finish my catalogue, as far as it comprehends the beautiful women. For Clearchus speaks thus concerning Epaminondas. Epaminondas the Theban behaved with more dignity than these men did, but still there was a want of dignity in the way in which he was induced to waver in his sentiments and his association with women, as anyone will admit who considers his conduct with the Laconian's wife. But Hypereides the orator, having driven his son Glaucippus out of his house, received into it that most extravagant courtesan, Myrrhina, and kept her in the city. And he also kept Aristogora in the Piraeus, and Phyla at Ulysses, whom he brought for a very large sum, and then emancipated. And after that he made her his housekeeper, as Idomeneus relates. But in his oration in defense of Phryne, Hypereides confessed that he is in love with the woman, and yet, before he had got cured of that love, he introduced the above-mentioned Myrrhina into his house. Now, Phryne was a native of Thespiae, and being prosecuted by Euthias on a capital charge, she was acquitted, on which account Euthias was so indignant that he never instituted any prosecution afterwards, as Herpyllis tells us. But Hypereides, when pleading Phryne's cause, as he did not succeed at all, but it was plain that the judges were about to condemn her, brought her forth into the middle of the court, and tearing open her tunic and displaying her naked bosom, employed all the end of his speech with the highest rhetorical art, to excite the pity of her judges by the sight of her beauty, and inspire the judges with a superstitious fear, so that they were so moved by pity as not to be able to stand the idea of condemning to death a prophetess and priestess of Aphrodite. And when she was acquitted, a decree was drawn up in the following form: that hereafter no orator should endeavor to excite pity on behalf of anyone, and that no man or woman, when impeached, shall have his or her case decided on while present. But Phryne really was a beautiful woman, even in those parts of her person which was not generally seen, on which account it was not so easy to see her naked, for she used to wear a tunic which covered her whole person. But on the solemn assembly of the Eleusinian festival, and on the feast of Posidonia, then she laid aside her garments in the sight of all the assembled Greeks, and having undone her hair, she went to bathe in the sea. And it was from her that Apelles took this picture of Aphrodite and Idomene, and Praxiteles, the sculptor, who was a lover of hers, modeled the Aphrodite of Cnidus from her body. And on the pedestal of his statue of Eros, which is placed below the stage in the theatre, he wrote the following inscription: Praxiteles has devoted earnest care to representing all the love he felt, drawing his model from his inmost heart. I gave myself to Phryne for her wages, and now I no more charms employ, nor arrows, save those of earnest glances at my love. And he gave Phryne the choice of his statues, whether she chose to take the Eros or the Satyr, which is in the street called the Tripods, and she, having chosen Eros, consecrated it in the temple at Thespiae. And the people of her neighborhood, having had a statue made of Phryne herself, of solid gold, consecrated it in the temple of Delphi, having had it placed on a pillar of Pentelic marble, and the statue was made by Praxiteles. And when Crates the Cynic saw it, he called it a votive offering to the profligacy of Greece. And this statue stood in the middle between that of Archidamus, king of the Lacedaemonians, and that of Philippus, the son of Amyntas, and it bore this inscription: Phryne of Thespiae, the daughter of Epicles, as we are told by Alcetus in the second book of his treatise on the offerings at Delphi. But Apollodorus in his second book on Courtesans says that there were two women named Phryne, one of whom was nicknamed Klausigelos, weep laughter, and the other Saperdion, goldfish. But Herodotus, in the sixth book of his Essay on People Mentioned by the Comic Poets, says that the one who is mentioned by the orators was called Sestos, because she sifted and stripped bare all her lovers, and that the other was the native of Thespiae. But Phryne was exceedingly rich, and she offered to build a wall around Thebes, if the Thebans would inscribe on the wall, "Alexander destroyed this wall, but Phryne the courtesan restored it," as Callistratus states in his treatise on Courtesans. And Timocles, the comic poet, in his Neaera, has mentioned her riches, and so has Amphis in his Curus, and Gryleon was a parasite of Phryne's, though he was one of the judges of the Areopagus, as also Satyrus, the Olynthian actor, was also a parasite of Pamphila. But Aristogeiton, in his book against Phryne, says that her proper name was Nicarete, and I am aware that Diodorus Perigates says that the oration against her, which is ascribed to Euthus, is really the work of Anaximenes. But Posidippus, the comic poet, in his Ephesian Women, speaks in the following manner concerning her. Before our time, the Thespian Phryne was far the most famous of all courtesans, and even though you're later than her age, still you have heard of the trial which she stood. She was accused on a capital charge before the Heleia, being said to have corrupted all the citizens. But she besought the judges separately with tears, and so just saved herself from judgment. And I would have you all know that Demades, the orator, became the father of Demius by a female flute player who was a courtesan. And once, when Demius was giving himself airs on the speaker's platform, Hypereides stopped his mouth, saying, "Will not you be silent, young man? Why, you make more puffing than your mother did." And also Bion of Beresthenes, the philosopher, he was the son of the Lacedaemonian courtesan named Olympia, as Nicaeus, the Nicaean, informs us in his treatise called The Succession of Philosophers. And Sophocles, the tragic poet, when he was an old man, was a lover of Theris, the courtesan, and accordingly called on the favor and assistance of Aphrodite. He says, "Hear me now, praying goddess, nurse of youths, and grant that this my love may scorn young men, and their most feeble fancies and embraces, and rather cling to grey-headed old men, whose minds are vigorous, though their limbs are weak." And these verses are some of those which are at times attributed to Homer, but he mentioned Theris by name, speaking thus in one of his plain choruses, "For dear to me Theoris is." And toward the end of his life, as Hegesander says, he was a lover of the courtesan Archippe, and he left her the heiress of all his property. But as Archippe cohabitated with Sophocles, though he was very old, Smicranes, her former lover, being asked by someone what Archippe was doing, said very wittily, "Why, like the owls, she is sitting on the tombs." But Isocrates also, the most modest of all the orators, had a mistress named Metaneira, who was very beautiful, as Lysias relates in his letters. But Demosthenes, in his oration against Neaera, says that Metaneira was the mistress of Lysias. And Lysias was also desperately in love with Lagis, the courtesan, whose panegyric Cephalus the orator wrote, just as Alcidemus the Elean, the pupil of Gorgias, himself wrote a panegyric on the courtesan Lais. And in his oration against Philonides, who was under prosecution for an assault, if at least the oration is a genuine one, Lysias says that Lais was the mistress of Philonides, writing as follows, "There is then a woman who is a courtesan, Lais by name, whose keeper is Archias, but your friend Philonides states himself to be in love with her." Aristophanes also mentions her in his Geritades, and perhaps also in his Plutus, where he says, "Is it not owing to you, the greedy Lais, does love Philonides?" For perhaps here we ought to read Lais and not Lais. But Herpyllis, in his essay on Isocrates, says that Isocrates, when he was advanced in years, took the courtesan Lagisca to his house, and had a daughter by her. And Stratus speaks of her in these lines. And while she still was in her bed, I saw Socrates' concubine, Lagisca, playing her tricks, and with her the flute maker. And Lysias in his speech against Lais, if at least the oration is a genuine one, mentions her giving a list of other courtesans also, in the following words. Philyra indeed abandoned the trade of a courtesan while she was still young, and Scione, and Hippothecus, and Theoclea, and Semente, and Lagisca, and Anthea, and Aristoclea all abandoned it also at an early age. But it is reported that Demosthenes the orator had children by a courtesan. At all events, he himself, in his speech about the gold, introduced his children before the court, in order to obtain pity by their means, without their mother, although it was customary to bring forward the wives of those who were under trial. However, he did this for shame's sake, hoping to avoid calumny. But this orator was exceedingly addicted to amorous indulgences, as Idomeneus tells us. Accordingly, being in love with a youth named Aristarchus, he once, when he was intoxicated, insulted Nicodemus on his account and struck out his eyes. He is related also to have been extravagant in his table, and in his followers, and in women. Therefore his secretary once said, "But what can one say of Demosthenes? For everything that he has thought of for a whole year is thrown together in confusion by one woman in one night." Accordingly, he is said to have received into his house a youth named Neaera, although he had a wife, and she, being indignant at this, went herself and slept with Neaera. And Demetrius the king, the last of all Alexander's successors, had a mistress named Myrrhina, a Samian courtesan, and in every respect but the crown, he made her his partner in the kingdom, as Nicolaus of Damascus tells us. And Ptolemaeus, the son of Ptolemy Philadelphus the king, who was governor of the garrison in Ephesus, had a mistress named Eirene, and she, when plots were laid against Ptolemaeus by the Thracians at Ephesus, and when he fled to the temple of Artemis, fled with him. And when the conspirators had murdered him, Eirene, seizing hold of the bars of the doors of the temple, sprinkled the altar with his blood, till they slew her also. And Sophron, the governor of Ephesus, had a mistress, Danae, the daughter of Leontiయొn, the Epicurean, who was also a courtesan herself. And by her means he was saved when a plot was laid against him by Laodice. And Laodice was thrown down a precipice, as Phylarchus relates in his 12th book, in these words. Danae was a chosen companion of Laodice, and was trusted by her with all her secrets, and being the daughter of that Leontiయొn who had studied with Epicurus, the natural philosopher, and having herself formerly been the mistress of Sophron, she, perceiving that Laodice was laying a plot to murder Sophron, revealed the plot to Sophron by a sign. And he, understanding the sign, and pretending to agree to what Laodice was saying to him, asked 2 days to deliberate on what he should do. And when she had agreed to that, he fled away by night to Ephesus. But Laodice, when she learned what had been done by Danae, threw her down a precipice, discarding all recollection of their former friendship. And they say that Danae, when she perceived the danger which was impending over her, was interrogated by Laodice, and refused to give her any answer. But when she was dragged to the precipice, then she said that many people justly despise the deity, and they may justify themselves by my case, who, having saved a man who was to me as my husband, am requited in this manner by the deity. But Laodice, who murdered her husband, is thought worthy of such honor. The same Phylarchus also speaks of Mysta in his 14th book, in these terms. Mysta was the mistress of Seleucus the king, and when Seleucus was defeated by the Galatians, and was with difficulty able to save himself by flight, she put off the robes of a queen, which she had been accustomed to wear, and assumed the garment of an ordinary servant, and, being taken prisoner, was carried away with the rest of the captives, and being sold in the same manner as her handmaidens, she came to Rhodes, and there, when she had revealed who she was sent back with great honor to Seleucus by the Rhodians. But Demetrius of Phaleros, being in love with Lampito, a courtesan of Samos, was pleased when he himself was addressed as Lampito, as Dillus tells us, and he was also called Keratoblepharos, pretty eyes. And Nicarete the courtesan was the mistress of Stephanus the orator, and Metaneira was the mistress of Lysias the sophist. And these women were the slaves of Cassius the Elean, with many other such, as Antea, Stratola, Aristoclea, Phyla, Ismias, and Neaera. But Neaera was the mistress of Cyclades the poet, and of Hipparchus the actor, and of Phrynion of Paeania, who was the son of Damon and the nephew of Demochares. And Phrynion and Stephanus the orator used to have Neaera in turn each day, since their friends had so arbitrated the matter for them. And the daughter of Neaera, whose name was Strymbale, and who was afterwards called Phano, Stephanus gave, as if she had been his own daughter, in marriage to Frostor of Aegilia, as Demosthenes tells us in his oration against Neaera. And he also speaks in the following manner about Sinope the courtesan. And you punished Archias the Hierophant when he was convicted before the regular tribunals of having behaved with impiety, and offering sacrifices which were contrary to the laws of the nation. And he was accused also of other things, and among them of having sacrificed a victim on the festival of Haloa, which was offered by Sinope the courtesan on the altar which is in the court of the temple of Eleusis. Though it is against the law to sacrifice any victims on that day, and though too it was no part of his duty to sacrifice at all, but it belonged to the priestess to do so. Plangon the Milesian was also celebrated as a courtesan, and she, as she was most wonderfully beautiful, was beloved by a young man of Colophon, who already had Bacchus of Samos as his mistress. Accordingly, when this young man began to address his solicitations to Plangon, she, having heard of the beauty of Bacchus, wished to make the young man abandon his love for her. When she was unable to effect that, she required as the price of her favors the necklace of Bacchus, which was very celebrated. And he, as he was exceedingly in love, entreated Bacchus not to see him totally overwhelmed with despair. And Bacchus, seeing the excited state of the young man, gave him the necklace. And Plangon, when she saw the freedom from jealousy which was exhibited by Bacchus, sent her back the necklace, but kept the young man. And ever after Plangon and Bacchus were friends, loving the young man in common, and the Ionians being amazed at this, as Minotaur tells us in his treatise on votive offerings, gave Plangon the name of Pasiphae, dear to all. And Archilochus mentions her in the following lines. As a fig tree planted on a lofty rock feeds many crows and jackdaws, so Pasiphae's a willing entertainer to all strangers. That Menander the poet was a lover of Glycera is well known by everybody, but still he was not well pleased with her, for when Philemon was in love with a courtesan, and in one of his plays called her excellent, Menander in one of his plays said, in contradiction to this, that there was no courtesan who was good. And Harpalus the Macedonian, who robbed Alexander of vast sums of money and then fled to Athens, being in love with Pythionike, spent an immense deal of money with her, and she was a courtesan. And when she died, he erected a monument to her which cost him many talents. And as he was carrying her out to burial, as Posidonius tells us in the 22nd book of his history, he had the body accompanied with a band of the most eminent artists of all kinds, and with all sorts of musical instruments and songs. And Dicaearchus, in his essay on the descent to the cave of Trophonius, says, And that same sort of thing may happen to anyone who goes to the city of the Athenians, and who proceeds by the road leading from Eleusis, which is called the Sacred Road. For if he stops at the point from which he first get a sight of Athens, and of the temple, and of the citadel, he will see a tomb built by the wayside, of such a size that there is none other near which can be compared with that of its magnitude. And at first, as would be natural, he would pronounce it to be the tomb, beyond all question, of Miltiades, or Cimon, or Pericles, or of some other great men of Athens, and above all, he would feel sure that it had been erected by the city at the public expense, or at all events by some public decree. And then, again, when he heard it was the tomb of Pythionike the courtesan, what must be his feelings? And Theompapus, also in his letter to Alexander, speaking reproachfully of the profligacy of Harpalus, says, But just consider and listen to the truth, as you may hear from the people of Babylon, as to the manner in which he treated Pythionike when she was dead, who was originally the slave of Bacchus, the female flute player, and Bacchus herself had been the slave of Sinope, the Thracian, who brought her establishment of harlots from Aegina to Athens, so that she was not only trebly a slave, but also trebly a harlot. He, however, erected 2 monuments to her at an expense exceeding 200 talents, and everyone marveled that no one of all those who died in Cilicia in defense of the dominions and of the freedom of the Greeks had had any tomb adorned for them either by him or by any other of the governors of the state, but that a tomb should be erected to Pythionike the courtesan, both in Athens and in Babylon, and they have now stood a long time. For a man who ventured to call himself a friend to you has dared to consecrate a temple and a spot of ground to a woman whom everybody knew to have been common to everyone who chose at the same fixed price, and to call both the temple and the altar those of Aphrodite Pythionike, and in so doing he despised all the vengeances of the gods, and endeavored to insult the honors to which you are entitled. Philemon also mentions these circumstances in his comedy called The Babylonian, where he says, "You shall be queen of Babylon if the fates will but permit it. Sure, you recollect Pythionike and proud Harpalus." Alexis also mentions her in his Lyciscus. But after the death of Pythionike, Harpalus sent for Glycera, and she was also a courtesan, as Theopompus relates, when he says that Harpalus issued an edict that no one should present him with a crown, without at the same time paying a similar compliment to his prostitute, and adds, he had also erected a brazen statue to Glycera in Rossus of Syria, where he intends to erect one of you, and another of himself, and he has permitted her to dwell in the palace in Tarsus, and he permits her to receive adoration from the people, and to bear the title of queen, and to be complimented with other presents, which are only fit for your own mother and your own wife. And we have a testimony coinciding with this from the author of the satiric drama called Agen, which was exhibited on the occasion when the Dionysian festival was celebrated on the banks of the river Hydaspes, by the author, whether he was Python of Catana or Byzantium, or the king himself, and it was exhibited when Harpalus had fled to the seashore after he had revolted, and it mentions Pythionike as already dead, and Glycera as being with Harpalus, and as being the person who encouraged the Athenians to receive the presents from Harpalus, and the verses of the play are as follows. A. There is a pinnacle where never birds have made their nests, where the long reeds do grow, and on the left is the illustrious temple raised to a courtesan, which Pallades erected, but, repenting of the deed, condemned himself for it to banishment. And when some of the magi of the barbarians saw him oppressed by the stings of conscience, they made him trust that they could raise again the soul of Pythionike. And the author of the play calls Harpalus Pallades in this passage, but in what follows he speaks of him by his real name, saying, B. But I do wish to learn from you, since I dwell a long way from thence, what is the fate at present of the land of Athens, and how all its people fare. A. Why, when they said that they were slaves, they had plenty to eat, but now they have raw vegetables only, and fennel, and but little corn and meat. B. I likewise hear that Harpalus had sent them a quantity of corn no less than Agen, and has been made a citizen of Athens. A. That corn was Glycera's, but it is perhaps to them a pledge of ruin, not of a courtesan. Now Crates also produced some very celebrated courtesans of exceedingly good beauty. For instance, Dorica, who became the mistress of Caraxus, the brother of the lovely Sappho, when he went to Naucratis on some mercantile business. Sappho accuses Dorica in her poetry of having stripped Caraxus of a great deal of his property. But Herodotus calls her Rhodopis, being evidently ignorant that Rhodopis and Dorica were 2 different people, and it was Rhodopis who dedicated those celebrated spits at Delphi. Posidippus also made this epigram on Dorica, although he had often mentioned her in his Aesopia, and this is the epigram. Here, Dorica, your bones have long been laid. Here is your hair and your well-scented robe. You who once loved the elegant Caraxus, and quaffed with him in the morning bowl of wine. But Sappho's pages live, and still shall live, in which is many a mention of your name, which still your native Naucratis shall cherish, as long as any ships sail down the Nile. Archedigia was also a native of Naucratis, and she was a courtesan of great beauty. For somehow or other, as Herodotus says, Naucratis is in the habit of producing beautiful courtesans. There was also a certain courtesan named Sappho, a native of Eresus, who was in love with the beautiful Phaon, and she was very well celebrated, as Nymphus relates in his Voyage Around Asia. But Nicarete of Megara, who was a courtesan, was not a woman of ignoble birth, but she was born of free parents, and was very well calculated to excite the affection by reason of her accomplishments. And she was a pupil of Stilpo, the philosopher. There was also Billistike, the Argive, who was a very celebrated courtesan, and who traced her descent back to the Atreidae, as those historians relate who have written the history of the affairs of Argolis. There was also a certain courtesan named Laena, whose name is very celebrated, and she was the mistress of Harmodius, who slew the tyrant. And she, being tortured by the command of Hippias the tyrant, died under the torture, without having said a word. Stratocles the orator also had for his mistress a courtesan whose name was Lemmy, and who was nicknamed Parorama, because she used to let whoever chose come to her for 2 drachmas, as Gorgias says in his treatise on courtesans. Now, though Myrtillus appeared to be intending to say no more after this, he resumed his subject, and said, I was nearly forgetting, my friends, to tell you of Lydia of Antimachus, and also of her namesake, Lyde, who was also a courtesan and the mistress of Lamentius the Milesian. For each of these poets, as Clearchus tells us in his Tales of Love, being inflamed with love of the barbarian Lyde, wrote poems, the one in elegiac and the other in lyric verse, and they both entitled their poems Lyde. I omit also mention of the female flute player Nano, the mistress of Myrrhina, and Leontiయొn, the mistress of Hermoceniacs of Colophon. For he inscribed with her name, as she was his mistress, 3 books of elegiac poetry, in the third of which he gives a catalogue of the love affairs, speaking in the following manner. Such was she whom the dear son of Orpheus, armed only with a lyre, brought back from Hades, even the Thracian Agriope. Aye, he sailed to that evil and inexorable place where Charon drags in the common bark the souls of the departed, and over the lake he shouts afar as it pours its flood from out the tall reeds. Yet Orpheus, though girded for the journey all alone, dared to sound his lyre beside the wave, and he won over the gods of every shape. Even the lawless Cocytus he saw raging beneath his bangs, and he flinched not before the gaze of the hound Cerberus, most dread, his voice baying forth angry fire, with fire his cruel eyes gleaming, an eye that on triple heads bore terror. Whence by his song Orpheus persuaded the mighty lords that Agriope should recover the gentle breath of life. Nor did the son of Mene, Musaeus, master of the graces, cause Antiope to go without her due of honor, and she besides Ulysses' strand expounded to the initiates the loud sacred voice of mystic oracles, as she duly escorted the priest through the Rarian plain to honor Demeter, as she is known even in Hades. I say, too, that Boeotian Hesiod, master of all lore, left his hall and went to the Heliconian village of the Arsacrians, because he was in love, whence in wooing Eoe, maid of Ascra, he suffered many pangs, and as he sang, he wrote all the scrolls of his catalogues, even proceeding from a girl's name, or such as her. But that bard himself, whom the decree of Zeus forever ordains to be the sweetest divinity among all poets, the godlike Homer, languaged to thinness, and set Ithaca in the strains of song for the love of wise Penelope. For her sake he went, with many sufferings, to that small isle, far from his own wide country, and he celebrated the kin of Icarius, the folk of Amyclus, and Sparta too, ever mindful of his own misfortunes. And Mimnermus, who discovered after much suffering the sweet sound and spirit breathed from the languorous pentameter, burned for Nano, yet often upon his venerable flute bound to his lips, he with Hexamilles would hold revel, but he quarrelled with Hermobius, the ever-cruel, and Pericles too, his foe, whom he loathed for taunts which he hurled against him. And Timachus too, smitten with love for the Lydian girl Lyde, trod the ground where the Pactolus river flows, and when she died, in his helplessness he placed her in the hard earth, weeping the while, and in his woe he left her there and returned to lofty Colophon. Then he filled his pious scrolls with plaints, and rested after all his pain. As for the lesbian Alcaeus, you know in how many revels he engaged, when he smote his lyre with yearning love for Sappho, and the bard who loved that nightingale caused sorrow by the eloquence of his hymns to the Teian poet. Yea, for the honey-voiced Anacreon contended for her whose beauty was supreme among the many women of Lesbos, and at times he would leave Samos, at times again his own city, that nestles against the vine-covered hills, and visit Lesbos, rich in wine, and often he gazed upon Lectum, the Mysian headland across the Aeolian wave. How, too, the Attic bee, Sophocles, left Colonae of the many hillocks, and sang with choruses marshalled in tragedy, sang of Bacchus and of his passion for Theoris and for Erigone, whom Zeus once gave to Sophocles in his old age. I say, too, that that man, Euripides, who had ever guarded himself against passion, and had won the hatred of all men by his railings concerning all women, was, none the less, smitten by the treacherous bow, and could not lay aside his pangs by night. Nay, in Macedonia he traversed all the byways in his woe, and became dependent on the steward of Archelaus, until at last fate found destruction for Euripides, when he met the cruel hounds of Aribius. And that poet from Cythera, whom the nurses of Bacchus reared, and the Muses thought to be the most faithful steward of the flute, Philoxenus. You know how he was racked with pain, and passed through our city to Ortygia, for you have heard of his mighty yearning, which Galatea esteemed less than the very firstlings of the flock. You know also of that bard in whose honor the townsmen of Eurypylus, the men of Cos, raised a bronze statue beneath the plane tree. He, Philetus, sang his love for the nimble Bittis, versed as he was in all the terms of love, and in all its speech. Yea, not even all the mortals who ordained for themselves a life austere, seeking to find the dark things of wisdom, those men whom their very craft caused to choke in the shrewd contests of debate, and their dread skill, which bestowed its care upon eloquence, not even they could turn aside the awful maddening turmoil of Eros, but they fell beneath the power of that dread charioteer. Such was the madness for Theano, that bound with its spell the Samian Pythagoras. Yet he had discovered the refinements of geometric spirals, and had modelled in a small globe the mighty circuit of the enveloping ether. And with what fiery power did Cyprus in her wrath heat Socrates, whom Apollo had declared to be the supreme among all men in wisdom? Yea, though his soul was deep, yet he laboured with lighter pains when he visited the house of Aspasia, nor could he find any remedy, though he had discovered the many cross paths of logic. Even the man of Cyrene, keen Aristippus, was drawn by overpowering love beyond the isthmus when he fell in love with Lais of Epidani. In his flight he renounced all discourse, and expounded a life of worthlessness. But in this, Hermesianax is mistaken when he represents Sappho and Anacreon as contemporaries, for the one lived in the time of Cyrus and Polycrates, but Sappho lived in the reign of Alyattes, the father of Croesus. But Chameleon, in his treatise on Sappho, does assert that some people say that these verses were made upon her by Anacreon. Eros, the golden-haired god, struck me with his purple ball, and with his many wiles doth seize, and challenge me to sport with him. But she, and she from Lesbos comes, that populous and wealthy isle, laughs at my hair and calls it gray, and will prefer a younger lover. And he says, too, that Sappho says this to him: You, O my golden-throned muse, did surely dictate that sweet hymn which the noble Teian bard from the fair and fertile isle, chief muse of lovely womanhood, sang with his dulcet voice. But it is plain enough in reality that this piece of poetry is not Sappho's, and I think myself that Hermesianax is joking concerning the love of Anacreon and Sappho, for Diphilus, the comic poet, in his play called Sappho, has represented Archilochus and Hipponax as the lovers of Sappho. Now it appears to me, my friends, that I have displayed some diligence in getting up this amorous catalogue for you, as I myself am not a person so mad about love as Cainocus, with his calumnious spirit here, has represented me. I confess, indeed, that I am amorous, but I do deny that I am frantic on the subject. And why should I dilate upon my sorrows, when I may hide them all in night and silence, as Aeschylus the Alexandrian has said in his Amphitryon? And this is the same Aeschylus who composed the Messenian epic, a man of great learning. End of Mistresses of Famous Men, taken from Book 13 of the Deipnosophists by Athenaeus of Naucratis, translated by C.D. Young, 1854.